Hello, hello, hello. And today we are not on the war report. We're just having a general discussion. I mean, what happens a lot, my friend GSP and I, we have a lot of conversations after the show. They go in many directions. And one of the ones that came up last week was the war in Yugoslavia. And we just want to play on that, have a general discussion about that, about what happened and what it means today, and how, in a way, it's almost a microcosm of a battle of three different civilizations. So, uh, a nice Friday night discussion. So, we've got some
Nice.
viewers pouring in, and let's get right into it. So, seeing as you are the Yugoslavian, I think I should let you take the reins on this one.
Okay, well, I thought I'd establish just a little bit of historical context to the pre-formation of Yugoslavia. Uh, so as we discussed, Yugoslavia was sort of a fault line between the West, the East, what I would call the Orthodox East, and the Ottoman Empire. And the story, in many ways, has to deal with a people. There are other groups, there are other ethnicities, but a people, which I would say are the Serbian, Serbo-Croatian people, divided in three ways. And it's also reflective of how Europe was divided, and it still continues to be divided in that way. And so just to give a little bit of historical context, Southern Slavs did have a desire to form some kind of a state that would bring them freedom out of both the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this goes as far back as the 17th century. Yugoslavia was formed as part of the Serbian kingdom very shortly. In fact, just a few months after World War One, and it was the Slovenians and the Croatians who actually asked for that. Now, Serbia was the only country really with an army and any kind of independence. They also fought very well against the Austro-Hungarians, but they lost a massive amount of people. In fact, 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 of of Serbians died in that war. And I think that goes a long way to explain why I think lots of Serbians felt that, Yugoslavia was more their project, or why they were entitled to something a little more because of course, is the sacrifice. Um, I should also note that at this time there were in the official draft there was no designation of Bosnians. Or Macedonians or Montenegrins. These were considered peoples who were Serbs in some ways. Uh, uh, for instance, like in the 1800s, there was a kind of a revision of the Serbian language, and uh, it was more like what Macedonian is like today. It was different, and in some parts of southern Serbia, it still has what I would call like a kind of Macedonian or Macedon-Bulgarian influence. But that changed. You can still hear it in old Serbian folk songs from the 1920s and earlier. So now that's Yugoslavia after World War One and prior to World War Two. Did you have any questions?
I do not, but I actually didn't know that it was initially a Serbian project. I just figured they just slapped territory together at the war, which is true to an extent. But what it also reminds me of is this is a much less drastic situation, but the formation of Czechoslovakia. I remember in the 19th century, the Czechs wanted independence, and so did the Slovaks. And eventually, they decided they would rather have a Slavic state between the two of them than live under Austrian rule. So it became a joint independence movement to become Czechoslovakia. And the way you described it, it kind of reminds me of that. But another thing I noticed, Yugoslavia's first name, as you mentioned, there wasn't really a Bosnia or Macedonia in the initial formation. It was the kingdom of the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, right?
Yeah. Well, it was the Kingdom of Serbia and Yugoslavia. So it was under King Peter. So it was like I say, Slovenes and Croats asked to be w within the kingdom to form the state.
Oh, okay, okay, that makes sense. And based on my rudimentary knowledge of Yugoslavia, because I actually planned on doing a video on this a few months back, but it never panned out. That basically what happened is you had some assassination attempts, which led to pretty much dictatorship of the crown in the 1920s.
Right. I'm not as well versed in the very early formation, but that is the case. Yes. And of course, we already know about Franz Ferdinand and so on.
Yeah, yeah, that's all way before this, and it's crazy because another thing you have to look at is I have a different view of it not being a Slav, being a Westerner raised in the United States. I didn't know that. Of course, I brought you on for this perspective in particular, but I think for the world at large, they should have seen during the Axis occupation during World War II the way things divided. How, for example, there was the Croatian puppet state under the Nazis. There were the Chetniks. There was the Yugoslav partisans. That this country was not going to work. So I think that should have been a sign to the world that it was a mistake. Maybe I'm wrong on that note, but
Well, I mean, I think for its time, uh, there was a possible, like I think the zeitgeist at the time, of course, was nationalism, and a lot of these small, Slavic ethnicities that had belonged to other empires um, felt that the only way they could achieve a certain amount of autonomy was by joining forces, because many of them were only separated, say, by religion, not by language, not even by custom. Or you could say that with Czech and Slovakia, you could say that the languages were slightly different, but mutually intelligible. However, they were both Catholic. So there were differences, but I think, like, I look at it as an interregnum, that they are able to have these small independent states now with more autonomy than they had prior when they were joined within one state, an independent state, not in an Ottoman Empire, not in an Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I mean, I can understand why they thought it would work in their time. Let's not forget that France also had to consolidate its power. England had to consolidate its power, say with reference to Scotland, and in many ways they had greater differences to overcome. So, I mean, that's the history of a lot of nations. Is that if if the power is overly it was shared amongst too many different parties, um, there's a chance that the nation will divide.
that makes sense.
But I think for its time, it wasn't it wasn't really so unusual.
Yeah, I understand. It seems like in what you had in the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, you had a lot of pan-ethnic movements. For example, the Pan-Germanic movement, the unification of Germany, the Pan-Italian movement, and you could say the Pan-Slavic movement, which, of course, more the out there types of that wanted every Slavic people united under one state. But again, Yugoslavia technically Pan-Slavism, so I can understand during the formation why it would have made sense. But another thing I found interesting is after the war, of course, Tito took power, and what his policy was, to my understanding, he pretty much tried to create a singular Yugoslavian identity. You're not a Serb, you're not a Croat, you're not a Bosnian, you're not any of these groups. You're Yugoslavian. So instead of having the republics of Serbia and Croatia within the Union, he broke the Union down into several territories along arbitrary lines that weren't really based on ethnicity or history in an attempt to create that new identity. So, and I
Well,
think
I
it's
would
interesting.
say that,
Go on.
um, yeah. So the problem is it was take Bosnia for instance, right? Like in terms of territory, the dominant group in just territory, not population, is Serbian. However, control of Sarajevo is by Bosnians, and there's a significant amount of Croatians as well, right? It would have been very hard the way the land is divided to a kind of contiguous border, right? It really is like oil and water in the way that oil spreads all about. Um, you also have the Krajina area where you have ethnic Serbs living in what is predominantly a Croatian territory. There were considered republics, right? But it's true. Like I remember as a kid, the emphasis was that you were Yugoslav first, and you were a Serb, a Croat, a Slovene, a Macedonian, a Bosnian second, right? But in that mix, you also have Albanians who aren't even Slavs. They kept moving into Kosovo from Albania, and this went on for quite a while. And by the time 1974 came around with the Yugoslav constitution, Tito granted them more rights. He also granted Croatia more rights. So, you know, that meant, you know, language, one's own language, textbooks, history, so on. So they were given far more autonomy.
Okay. I do have this a bit more of an opinion question than anything. I know a lot of the issue with the war, especially later on in the late 90s with the U.S. involvement, mainly involved Kosovo. So, do you think if at some point, no matter what it would have been, if the Yugoslavians would have had a declaration or some kind of decree to expel the Albanians, do you think it would have led to less problems?
I think it would have had less problems, but I think the outcome was probably going to be the same. Um, like I say, I think it was a temporary solution. I'm not sure everyone saw it that way, primarily because the kind of ideas that we had about nationalism, the theories that we have about nationalism and national identity, in and of themselves, arise out of the 19th century, right? And a lot of those are being disproven, or they don't work in a different context. So yeah, I would say that, I think problems would eventually have arisen anyways. There is some blame with the Albanian question, but they're not the root they're not the root cause of it. It's 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 how can I put it, a an unfortunate circumstance.
Tragic chance, if you will,
Yeah.
to borrow a phrase. But like I said, you'll notice anyone who has looked at any rudiment of Yugoslav history, as I'm not going to admit to being an expert, but from my analysis, basically from when Tito took power to the time he died when she was still in office, after his death, things went downhill very fast, or was it more gradual?
No, it was. So Tito died in 1980, and it was around this time that Yugoslavia was receiving loans from both the East and the West, especially after Tito's row with Stalin in 1948. The West looked at Yugoslavia as, a different kind of communism. Let's say a more, slightly more liberal society. You could leave Yugoslavia, for instance. Many Yugoslavs went on to, work and live, say, in France and Germany and so on. So it wasn't part of the Iron Curtain. However, both Tito and Russia relied on Serbs, especially given their mutual histories. So, you know, in the end, by the time of the late 80s, Yugoslavia was taking out loans to pay loans that they couldn't pay back. But an interesting note, about Tito, about the loans, and about the kind of communism that was practiced. It was initially like a very sort of a very democratized kind of communism. Workers could vote; they could decide on the direction that a company went and how its investments would be sorted out and where they would be put. Um, so this gave him a certain amount of autonomy. For instance, when the IMF um, was asked to give loans to Yugoslavia, the IMF said only on stipulation that this system is dissolved immediately. So I always thought that was a kind of an interesting fact, because it was to some extent a socialism that was working. But I mean, I have other ideas about, why that system was chosen and also the kind of the historical background as to why it was more likely to have been chosen. And I would say that, after the war, a kind of central planning is really necessary. You're thinking about provisions, you're thinking about shelter, you're thinking of creating, the basic infrastructure for a state for things to run on time. And there's no way around this. You can't play with ideas about, privatization. It's immediately after the war, and other countries are quickly rebuilding, and you have to as well. So, so this particular approach made sense for Yugoslavia, and it made sense for for other several other um, Eastern European countries. But I would also say, like, you can see it in the Soviet flag, the idea of the industrial hammer and the sickle for agriculture, right? That, like, Eastern Europe had been part of other empires for a very long time, and even the Russian Empire was largely an agrarian empire, not an industrial one. And so, if we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and we're going to talk about, a modern Western liberal state, right? Um, that kind of a state is going to create all kinds of things that would never occur in these other cultures. So, for instance, Nintendo, Atari, these kinds of video games, for instance, would never even occur there. No one would even think of it. What's the point of it? Why is it even necessary? So you can see that, the West is in many ways an older civilization. It's already further developed, and had already gone through this period, like at least a century or 2 centuries earlier.
I'd say
So
even more, honestly.
yeah, even more. But so I would say that helps in understanding, why some of these countries made these choices, instead of like instead of the kind of unconscious liberal idea that everybody starts on an equal footing, and the history doesn't matter. And they were persuaded by this evil cartel. I'm not saying there aren't evil cartels, but by this evil cartel to choose this. It's not quite as simple as that. Is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean the blank slate theory is just it makes absolutely no sense. But I think it's interesting what you said about the central planning, especially after the war in Yugoslavia, because I would say out of all the communist regimes, they were probably the most successful at quote unquote true communism. So I don't know why that is. I mean, I do know to an extent, but it's very interesting microcosm because I think just on that, it's also interesting what you said about Tito receiving loans in Yugoslavia in general, receiving loans from both the East and West countries. In fact, Tito was the founder of the non-alignment alignment movement. So it's just like an interesting country all around where on the surface, a lot of these things just seem extremely out of place, but the more you read into them, the more they make sense is what I'm trying to get out here. And
Yeah.
definitely about them being a younger civilization. A lot of people will point to it and say, "Oh, look at that failure and that failure." Now, the way communism played out, again, I'm not trying to defend communism here, played out because the it happened mainly in Slavic Eastern Europe. I mean, you can point to examples in Asia, which you can tell are drastically different than the ones that happened in Eastern Europe. But if the West had their communist revolutions, I think it would have been bloody. I think, but I think it wouldn't have been as bloody just based on the fact that, as you said, they're an older civilization. I think whether they would have assumed communism or free market capitalism or state as monarchism, there would have been a lot of bloodshed and infighting. Simply, as you said, because they're a younger culture and younger civilization.
Right. That period for Western Europe was really the Reformation and the revolutions that followed after the American and the French. Right. Like that is what sort of set them in a certain direction, different than what they had been from, say, 1000 AD to 1500. Right. That was the pivotal moment for them, and that was a very bloody period. But in a way, that established a direction that the West has been going on for like at least the last 300 years. But it too had this kind of bloody period shortly after the high medieval and early Renaissance.
Oh, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of issues. I mean, I think we're all guilty of it, no matter what culture you come from, is trying to view different cultures through your lens and assuming certain things. And like I said, I'm guilty of it. I mean, imagine everyone is. But yeah, it's also interesting that it lasted as long as it did. Like I said, there's more to it than that. But I figured just with all the outside forces. Like, I mean, I know Yugoslavia wasn't solidly in the Warsaw Pact, wasn't even the Warsaw Pact at all, or part of the Iron Curtain, but I figured there still would have been a lot more foreign subversion trying to fund separatist movements there. So I'm surprised it stayed as stable as long as it did in that regard, considering the fact there were so
Mhm.
many weak points a foreign power could exploit.
Yeah, and that came at the end. For instance, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved, America cut off all aid to Yugoslavia, and that kind of accelerated what would eventually happen. And guns were being funneled in through Hungary, um, into Croatia. So yeah, I mean I guess the inevitable in hindsight happened. I mean, Tito did his best to try to keep everything working, try to keep everything together. It was a one-party system. He was the president for life, and all the negative connotations that go along with that. And he did try. I mean, Tito was a Croatian, by the way. He came from a town on the border between Croatia and Slovenia, and I believe his mother was also Slovenian. Um, but he
Yeah,
even
he
took
was
up like,
Croatian Slovenian.
yeah, and he even paid a significant amount of respect to the Serbs. Like for instance, in the 1800s, a tradition arose out of Serbia to commemorate the war in Kosovo in 1389. This is a famous battle where the Serbs lost, but 12 of the knights went after the Sultan, and one of them reached the Sultan and killed him. Um, and so the tradition was that if someone had the ninth son, uh, someone would receive like a godfather, right? And so Tito became like a godfather to like the ninth son. Later, girls were included as well. And he did this for 20 years, but it got to the point he had so many godchildren, and all of them, expected certain privileges that it simply couldn't go on anymore. And
Yeah, that
I mean, also, you have to think of a state, like Yugoslavia. It's not just like we talk about the cultural differences and so on. Even though to a Westerner, actually the cultures seem quite similar in many ways. Um, but it's also the memories, the memories of World War II, the the genocide against the Serbs by the Croatians who sided with the Nazis. There were times even where Germans and Italians had to step in to stop them. Um, and that's really ironic when you think after World War One, it was these groups who approached the Kingdom of Serbia in order to be included in this state. Um, and then that is what should follow after. And that was not ideologically motivated. That was ethnically motivated. It's a very, very dark period in Yugoslavian history. Now, I mean, I have Croatian friends, and if any of them are listening, I'm sure they'll probably they might be pissed off. They might have some nuances to add to that. I'm open to it, but that is a fact that did happen. Um, so, I've had talks with some Croatians, who actually think like we could probably, the nostalgic part of me, of course, sometimes thinks wouldn't it be great because I lived there when it was really great, when all of this wasn't happening, when Tito was still alive, and so I understand that nostalgia about, maybe reunifying, but it will never ever be reunified again. That will simply never happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And um, I mean, it's taken even this long for Serbia and Croatia to have decent relations on a diplomatic level, if you can even say they have them now, just because of what happened. So to think that they're going to all of a sudden unify it's crazy. And one of the, I'd say most, I don't know how to put it, I'd say one of the most sick things about all of this is you have the European Union courting Baltic states by bringing up these memories.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that in both wars, but especially in the first one, there were two. I guess most of our listeners know that. Um, the way the West depicted the narrative that they ran with is really, I mean, it's horrible, especially Christiana Amanpour, with her stories about Slobodan Milosevic, CNN with Slobodan Milosevic is literally the next Hitler, and Time and Newsweek showing the bombing of Serbia, and in big bold letters, bringing Serbia to heel. Will bombing bring peace? Right? I mean, I already knew it was a foregone conclusion when those wars were raging that Croatia and Slovenia would become part of NATO and the EU. That was obvious. Um, but so this, I mean, the way the West dealt with it was kind of, I guess it set the tone for everything that came after. For instance, the PR firm that handled, the warming people up to the bombing of Serbia was the same PR firm. Well, there were two, but one of those two PR firms was the same firm who brought up the whole Iraqi soldiers are taking premature babies out of Kuwaiti hospitals and leaving them on the floor to die. That was a totally bogus story. The girl who made that lie, of course, has admitted it was a lie. And a lot of things have changed. The World Court, the UN now says that there was no genocide in Srebrenica. That in fact there were several killings. It was not 8,000, probably more like 1,000, and that both sides did it. And there is no genetic way to prove who's Bosnian and who's Serbian because essentially they are the same people divided by religion. So that war, I think, as much as the first war in Iraq, set the tone for the way the media was going to work with the American government and how they were going to incorporate the weaponization of quote unquote human rights.
Oh, absolutely. And just to let you know, you are having a little bit of robot issues. It's not too bad as it stands, but I
Oh,
figured
okay.
I would just put that
Sorry
out there.
about
But
that.
yeah, just the whole trying to play on the humanitarian, like, oh, we must intervene for the greater good and for human rights. That, like, Yugoslavia was the first example of that. I mean, you would have interventions, of course, unjustified ones justified by saying, oh, they're a threat by making up some fake threat, but they didn't try to say that Milosevic, I'm not entirely sure. You would probably actually know that one. They didn't say he was developing nukes or had WMDs or used chemical weapons. They just said, "Oh, he's abusing human rights. He's genocidal. Look, all these people who are genetically the same are fighting a war with each other. So that's all of a sudden genocide." But I think the one thing we do have to discuss when it comes to Yugoslavia and the Yugoslav wars is the anti-NATO songs that came out of 1990s Yugoslavia.
The
They're all,
songs, you
they're
mean
all very catchy tunes.
yeah,
Yes.
they are very catchy. They are very catchy. This isn't something most people know, but the Smiths and Morrissey are very popular in Yugoslavia because they're melancholy. Uh, I remember two Serbian
You,
friends. I
you
was
know,
driving with them. I didn't even know they knew or liked the Smiths. I know I do, and I couldn't believe it. They knew the words and so on. So, maybe that there's something to that. That kind of there is a melancholia there.
at
That
first I was like, what? But further thought, it does make sense. But correct, song that came out of 90s Yugoslavia that was literally Clinton.
sorry, you're breaking up. I'm gonna change to a slightly different location in case that helps things.
Oh, okay. I'll
Okay, there. That's better. I
uh,
can hear you.
how about now?
Still cutting out
Okay.
a.
Wasn't there an era literally called "Fuck You, Bill Clinton"?
I think there was. I'm trying to recall it. Yeah, I'm more familiar with like Bill Clinton in Kosovo. There's a Bill Clinton Avenue and a Bill Clinton statue, and a Hillary Clinton statue in Albania. Hello?
Uh, just hey, uh, are we working? Are we good?
You're still cutting out. How am I? Am I cutting out?
You're not, but I switched mics, so hopefully that helps. But I'll be right back.
Sorry, guys. It, we always run into these. It's always about halfway through the show that we get this, but Constantine will be back. Oh, there he is.
Hey, how about now?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, but I just thought it was worth mentioning as a side all the great songs that came out of the the war there. But I figured after discussing the history and the background, we should actually get into the conflicts that took place. So again, seeing as you are the Yugoslavian, I'm I am well versed on it, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert. You could take the reins, explain give our audience a run happened and why it happened.
Yeah, not that I'm an expert either, but very shortly after Tito's death, many of these various ethnicities began to assert their identities, their ethnic identities more so. And um, one of the lead ups to it was in Kosovo, actually, well before the Kosovo War. This is in the 80s. And certain miners went on strike. Also around this time is the time when Yugoslavia had taken the IMF loans and had restructured their economy based on what the IMF had wanted, on IMF stipulations. What this did is it basically created like an unemployment of nearly 50%, or people who were partly employed, or people who were working literally without without pay for long stretches of time. And so it wasn't just that Tito died, but economically, Yugoslavia ran into problems. Um, so there had been a small uprising in Kosovo of Albanian miners. Serbs for a long time had complained that they felt like second-class citizens within Kosovo, that they felt oppressed by them. And it's around this time that Milosevic comes into power and promises them that he will protect them. And by 1990, of course, the cracks developed even further. Um, Slovenia was the first republic to officially leave, the communist republics of Yugoslavia, followed later by Croatia. And soon after, that's when, and followed by Bosnia, of course, all of them did eventually. And so wars broke out, and they broke out in many different areas. Dubrovnik, for instance, which is a seaside city, a very old one, a very beautiful one. I remember going there many times when I was a kid. Um, that was sieged by the Serbs. It was being shelled there as was Sarajevo. Um, Serb minorities in Croatia were afraid that what happened in World War II would happen again. So they began arming themselves and put up a resistance. And some of these battles, of course, were very large. There was a tank battle that was like literally the largest tank battle since World War II that occurred in Bosnia. So um, this was the first Balkan War, the first Yugoslav war, and it's around this time as the fighting was going on that Macedonia also left Yugoslavia. Later it would be Montenegro, but now it's also around this time that we have the stories as we spoke about them earlier about Srebrenica that came up. Of course, in 2007, it was obvious that what media was saying was happening, what Western media was saying was happening, didn't happen quite like that, and that the story had been quite tweaked. Um, but that was resolved in 2007, long after people, gave up caring about what had happened there. Um, the war had several fronts. It was in many instances, it was a three-way war. Croats and Serbs were intent on getting parts of Bosnia. In the end, when America began bombing Serbia, of course, by the time the Second War with Kosovo came about, uh, Croatia was firmly on the side of the West, as were the Bosnians and the Kosovars. So Serbia was essentially isolated.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was a gradual chipping away, but I also think it's interesting and not really surprised, but interesting nonetheless, how Slovenia and Macedonia escaped completely unscathed. They completely jumped ship before they got pulled into a bigger conflict, which I mean, good for them, but it's interesting because the four people only talk about are Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo. And Kosovo always gets brought up later, but yeah, I think it's interesting because uh, I'm not going to say as in many wars, but as in plenty of wars, Yugoslavia being one of them, there was no real aggressor. It was just bound to happen. You can't place the blame for the war happening on any one side in this case. It was just the natural
Yeah.
conclusion of decades of events prior.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One of the writers on Social Matter, Mark Uri, he's a Croatian and he lived in Serbia or was in Serbia for a period of time. And he was asked, what do you think of Milosevic? And he said, as a Croat, I don't like Milosevic, but the idea that he was a genocidal maniac is wrong. The truth is, every side was intent in the 90s to have some kind of limited genocide or be genocided. Um, so he was again asked, where do you see Croatia in the future? Where would, back in Yugoslavia, an independent state, or remain in the EU or NATO? And he said, actually, I wouldn't want to see them in any of those situations. Croatia is a small state and a small power, and will have to deal with those difficulties of being in that position, as all those republics are in the former Yugoslavia. But his vision was that it would be better for Croatia to be, reabsorbed into Middle Europe, like into, some kind of allegiance with Hungary and Austria and Czech Republic and so on. So I thought that was interesting. That's a very original and different take. And it's kind of like it kind of reflects the way we've been, where we think things will be going in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's actually interesting you brought up that Croatian writer. The fact that he said, oh, yeah, Milosevic wasn't just hell bent on war and genocide and trying to exterminate all non Serbs, but he basically laid out that, yeah, it's a crumbling state, it's a free for all. You want to secure everything you can in order for your new independence. So it's going to be bloody, it's not going to be pleasant, but some unpleasant things have to be done in order to secure the survival of your nation. And that involves, unfortunately, the expulsion of some people, death outright. But I also think it's interesting because it was in 2014, I believe, that some human rights council or some court came out and exonerated Milosevic of most of his crimes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was the allegations in the kangaroo courts at that time was strictly for like American geopolitical interests, right? Like that was the whole point of it. Um, I also think it's ironic to contrast, say, Russia and Yugoslavia again, because um, Russia's inner turmoil was much greater when it was sorry, the Soviet Union's inner turmoil was, I would say, in some ways more pronounced than was Yugoslavia's before the breakup. And yet, when those breakups happened, uh, Russia's was pretty much nonviolent. All those republics left without with very, very little conflict, if any. With most, there was no conflict whatsoever. And ironically, with Yugoslavia, it was, you know, to date, it was the bloodiest conflict in Europe since World War II. That is true. Um, but there's also a way that, I think Yugoslavs and Westerners kind of look at Yugoslavia. There's a famous Slavoj Žižek video where he's on the bridge. It's very hilarious. He's in Ljubljana and he's by this river, and he says, "This river demarks the separation of Little Europa and the Balkan." And he says, he goes, you think this is a pretty street like Paris, so on and so forth, right? But on that side is Oriental despotism, crime, women get beaten, get raped, and like it. And on this side, Little Europa, the rule of law, women get beaten and raped and don't like it. He's such an utter madman. But he goes on to say that, for Croats, the Balkans begin with Serbia. And for the Slovenes, well, actually, the Balkans begin with Croatia. And for Austrians, well, the Balkans begin with Slovenia, not with them. And for the Germans, the Balkans begin with Austria, and so on and so forth. And lastly, you have Britain, who, at times, it appears that all of Europe is actually the Balkans. But and I understand that sentiment, and a colleague of Zizek's, mentioned that the Balkans represents the unconscious, the backwardness, the militarism that Europeans aren't honest about themselves with. And I mean, this is a very okay. I understand that this is a very leftist take. Those ideas have to be truths in order to arrive at only that conclusion. But I would go a step further. I have thought about that, and I would say that when it comes to civilizations in Europe that arise out of Europe, I would say that on an unconscious level, Europe is like a prize. That is, in and of itself, it doesn't really have a unity or can have a unity, or only has it for a very short time. And that every civilization that comes along looks at Europe as a unit, as a monolith, is a kind of prize, a thing to gain, a thing to have, right? Um, so I think when people talk about the Balkans and they talk about what it represents and how it's sort of the other or the shadow of Europe and so on, I look at it as kind of in many ways like the Balkans are the hinterland of, say, to use a historical parallel of the Rhine, or in at the during the time of the Romans. That it's But these grounds, however violent they are often fertile for creating a new civilization. But it's common for the older civilization to look at these areas in that way. So I look at it a slightly different way, maybe more
That's
different
probably
at
the
least.
most
What's that?
probably the most woke take I've heard on the Balkans, coming from a Balkanite. No surprise, but yeah, I do have to agree. It's like, oh yeah, here's where we did admit it, but here's where we like pretend like it doesn't happen. Here's where we take pride, and here's where we take shame in it. But I want to get on, seeing as we're running up to the close of the hour here. Uh, just on the Yugoslav wars, the American intervention. Now, with other American interventions such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, as backhanded as they may be, I still see the motive. I still see, well, oh, Iraq, we were helping out, a couple certain greatest allies. Same with Afghanistan. Same with Syria. But and like other wars we fought, for example, Vietnam. It's like, oh, this entirely ideological war, and I could go on and on about all the examples of American interventionism. How whether or not you could call them justified, you could see the intentions of the people who wanted to wage those wars, but Yugoslavia, I haven't pinned down yet. I lean towards saying it was ideological, trying to destroy the last vestige of communism in Europe,
I
just
don't
in order
think
to
I would disagree. I would disagree. I don't think it had
go,
anything to do
go,
with communism.
go on.
I don't think in the least it had anything to do with communism. Like I said, if in World War One, the communists were defeated and Russia was again a Tsarist empire, and it came out on the winning side, Western Europe would have a problem with that. It's not, I don't look at it as ideological at all. I mean, the Americans bombed Serbia during Easter when they knew that their anti-aircraft guns would be at at limited use. I mean, that's just pathetic. They also helped set up a rump Muslim state, Bosnia, in the middle of Europe. I don't see America doing anything vastly different than what Britain was doing with Turkey and Crimea in the 19th century. I think
I
I,
definitely agree.
I think America's actually guilty of war crimes with respect to Yugoslavia, with respect to Serbia. I really do.
I mean,
I mean,
I think
go
most
ahead.
people on our side agree on that point. I definitely do. I think, Bill Clinton, you can talk about what he's done, but I would say it's probably the least of his crimes compared to what he did in Yugoslavia, and to a lesser extent what he did in Iraq. I mean, granted, I say most of the, if we're looking at anyone to blame for the misery in Iraq, that's George W. Bush. But again, topic for
Yeah,
a different day. But
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
I I didn't think it was entirely ideological, but I could see the arguments for it. But like I said,
I mean, they're
I would put
celebrating Easter. They're supposed to be a communist country, but they're celebrating
yeah.
Easter. Like, really?
But I
I,
would say it was ideological insofar as not only was it about them being communists, that they hadn't kissed the ring of the neoliberal world order like the rest of Europe had
no,
at
they
that
hadn't.
point. And,
Yeah, that is true. That's all it was a power play. Uh, Croatia and Slovenia had kissed the ring, and Serbia wouldn't.
and I
Uh,
would say it was almost like a testing ground, an experiment, a test run of what they wanted to do all over the world. They were saying, we have this country that's falling apart already. Let's try it here. Let's see what happens.
yeah.
And just to
Yeah,
backtrack, wait, go on.
yeah. The other thing I think maybe we should. I don't want to steer this too far away, so I'm just going to say it very quickly. But the other thing I think we should talk about is, you talked about how this is it kind of sets the stage about what they're going to do, the liberal order, what is it going to do in the future, and how Yugoslavia is very much a test bed. I also look at it this way. Yugoslavia, in a way, is a template for what could happen in Hungary, for what, in the near future. All they need to do is prove that Orban is doing something that's just not tolerable, or that there's been some kind of a genocide, or a certain group has been targeted. And I think there would be an occupation. I think there would be a bombing.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, all they can say is, "Oh, he did this to the Roma population," and you could have tanks on the doorstep of Budapest within 72 hours, if even that. But uh, something else I find interesting, just to backtrack a little, is that the problem with the Soviet Union, they were more exasperated, but it seems like they died of exhaustion, whereas Yugoslavia died of a massive explosion. So,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, it had an economy that tried to compete on the world stage and couldn't. And I think it's also the story of a people who had been minorities in larger empires, and the capital of that empire was miles and miles away. And but this had been their history for hundreds of years. And um, the likelihood that they were going to um, advance and maintain pace with the rest of Western Europe, I think in hindsight we can see that's too optimistic. Also considering that it wouldn't be like I don't know. Let's suppose that we're talking about Belgium and the French half, or the Wallon, the Dutch speaking half wants to separate. Well, it's not like it's not an agrarian society. They're just as developed as the French in Belgium, so we can expect them to achieve a certain amount of independence, and that they would be pretty successful at it. You know, that could be the case in the future for Scotland, for instance. I'm not advocating one way or another about Scotland, but I'm just trying to find an example, right? Whereas Eastern Europe was never in that position, is what I'm saying. And yeah, it was an ideal, it was an experiment, and it had a tragic ending.
and just on the more American side, another probably one of the most interesting things I see in the Yugoslav wars is you have to consider from the 60s onwards, mainly Vietnam, that was the neoconservative infiltration of the American right wing, the American conservative movement, where they became very hawkish, very happy to go to war or commit regime change or do all these things that you would come to expect of them. But Yugoslavia, mainly I would say because Bill Clinton was the president intervening, is you started to see that growing anti-war sentiment on the right that I would say culminated in Trump.
Aha. Yes, very good point.
So, yeah, I thought that was interesting nonetheless because Yugoslavia, you have Bill Clinton saying, "Oh, we have to go in there for human rights." That's my best Bill Clinton Southern accent. I apologize for scarring the audience's ears with that one, but and you have a lot of people on the right wing who are really starting to wake up to the neoconservative thing slowly but surely and saying, why should we be bombing some country halfway across the world? How does this interest us? The communists have fallen. We have no interest here. But you have Bill Clinton coming up there grandstanding on human rights. You see Bush grandstanding on WMDs in Iraq that pushes some right wingers even further, despite them being very much on board at first, seeing the disaster that became of it. But yeah, I think it's interesting because not only was Yugoslavia this microcosm of Western Catholic civilization, Eastern Orthodox civilization, and Islamic civilization all coming together in one country and then tearing each other apart. It was also a microcosm of what happens all the way in the United States, just with the opinions of the liberals and conservatives.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, people have talked about the Balkanization of America, and I myself have been a proponent of it. I've been in favor of it. But the last week or two, after thinking about Yugoslavia, thinking about like North America and the West, but particularly America, uh, I don't know. I don't think there's going to be a Balkanization because I think America is already too hybridized. It's already too far on the road to where Brazil is. Um, and I'm not saying that to blackpill anybody, but um, what makes a people um, fight the way they do, just to sort of put things in contrast, is I forget who said it. To contrast the West and in Yugoslavia, someone said, "What folk dances do you know? What folk dances do you do?" And of course, nobody in the West knows any of them. They don't even exist anymore. They dance to like whatever you know Anglo-Afro music happens to be popular at the time. I mean, there hasn't been a society with a folk dance in generations. And he said, well, kids and teenagers in Yugoslavia, like in Croatia and Serbia and all over, like they know all of them. They know the singers, they know the folk dances. And so, I don't, I have thought about it. I'm not saying I know exactly what's going to happen or anything like that, but it seems much less likely than what I thought was possible, let's say even a month ago.
Yeah. To
Like
to
I
that
say,
I
this yeah, go ahead.
to that I will say in America, I don't see like an outright balkanization, but I basically see almost a balkanization everything but officially. I see, of course, people who are more on the right, people of more certain ethnic and racial groups segregating themselves to the point where we pretty much become a divided society but still living under one political entity.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, how that's going to be managed, I don't know. Will America get a Tito? Like, I don't know. I mean, that's what it will take to keep the machine going.
yeah, I definitely agree. You're going to either need somebody who's that much of a unifying figure, which I've seen other people theorize that they'll come along within the next few election cycles, or you're going to need to go completely to a raw federation or even confederation at that point where you have several highly autonomous states still under one umbrella that just agree for, almost to what the founders would have actually had us do and said, only agree for uh, cooperation on the world stage and agree to work together on that, but are completely different otherwise, which, um, yeah, definitely people trying to compare America to Yugoslavia saying, oh, they balkanized, it's going to happen here. It's a foolish argument. And yeah. But this has been a fun, interesting discussion. I actually learned quite a bit. I think it hashed out a lot of the things that we talk about, but on, I would
Hmm.
say, a bigger scale. Um, Definitely nice to have somebody with a degree of firsthand experience on the subject joining me on this. So, uh, unless you have any final thoughts, I think I'm going to bring it to a close.
No, that's about it. I'm sorry it wasn't. I am really truly sorry it wasn't maybe more upbeat. It is a Friday. Um, that's I had no intention of making it that way. That's the way it came out. I've been thinking about it, making notes, and usually I think everyone realizes I'm much more jovial and willing to joke, but uh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, I mean, I understand. Not every day is going to be the upbeat, high energy show. Again, this is more just
Well, I thought it was
a
a good show. I
broadcast
just think like
introduction.
maybe I was just maybe I wasn't as jovial as I could be. But I think the show was good.
It's fine. It's a nice, slow Friday evening stream. But thank you everyone for tuning in. We're going to be heading out. Of course, we will be back with the war report next week because, I mean, we always are. Except that one week I wasn't there, which didn't happen, by the way. So I will see you guys all next time. Try to get a video out tomorrow, and goodbye.